Welcome to week 5. 3 chapters in our primary text, chapters 6, 7, and 10. Now, I know last week we did chapter 12, the final chapter, and now we're jumping back to chapter 6, 7, and 10. Trust me, there is a method to our madness. It all has to do with the learning objectives that we have and the flow that we wanted to try to help bring learners through for the purpose of the course itself. So bear with me as we go back in time just a little bit, or go back in the text just a little bit. In this chapter, they explore several crisis communication theories. No surprise there, but the approach, or the approaches of these theories, share a focus on both the functional and the instrumental role of communication during a crisis. Now, your authors describe how communication is a factor that can help bring about credibility, stability, order, and even balance in times of a crisis. Baserman and Watkins described how, to some extent, crises are what they call predictable surprises. And I like that because it's something that we know is going to happen. I mentioned in weeks prior that you are going to face a crisis. The question is whether or not you're going to be prepared or not. With the advent of new technologies, the public is increasingly providing web-based first-hand accounts, whether that's through a blog or social media. Everybody has a video recorder in the palm of their hand when they have their phone, right? And so they kind of serve as what's known as a citizen journalist. It kind of blurs the lines between traditional media, new social media, citizen journalism, all that. But regardless of how blurred that line gets, keep in mind the basic principles of effective communication still remain key. Okay? Now, one of those basic tenets of crisis communication that I've learned over the years is that even with the best of intentions, missteps are commonplace when managing risks. We have an expression in the military that first reports are always wrong. When I was an engineer and I was sitting in what we call central control, when we would get a report from an engine room, especially if it was, something bad, like a switchboard went out or a fire or something like that, things are moving very quickly. And so people are reporting as quickly as they can based upon the limited knowledge that they have. And those reports ultimately turn out to be wrong, right? There's going to be nuances or things that we didn't know that we learned later. Expect that, and just know that we have to be prepared for that. One of the ways that we prepare in the military for crisis or contingencies or whatever you want to call it is what's known as a Joint Information Center. You can rest assured that there is at least one, most likely multiple Joint Information Centers around the world today, because we're always dealing with some trouble spot somewhere, right? It's a big planet, and we have a lot of responsibility. They tend to take on a life of their own. So the more planning you do in advance, the better. And we have them set up so they got laptops and cameras and cell phones and checklists and all these kinds of things that you need, so that you can just very quickly get to a site, set up, and you can start doing whatever you need to do. We're part of a much larger operation, but certainly communication is key to that. And hopefully, within your own organization, your organizational leaders have determined that communication plays a key role. I remember many what we call evacuation plans or contingency plans. There's usually a few key members of the staff that will evacuate with the senior leaders. So, for example, when I was a Pentagon press officer, if the Secretary of Defense, God forbid, had to evacuate, the public affairs officer, or Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, was one of the key people that went there. Usually the public affairs officer, the Judge Advocate General, an operations person, and then maybe 1 or 2 other staff that would go. When I was a recruiting command, the Admiral, myself, the Judge Advocate General, the lawyer, and the Chief of Staff, those were the 4 people that would get on a helicopter or whatever the fastest means of evacuation would be. And every organization I've been with in the military, the communicator, whatever that role is, usually public affairs officer, are one of the key people for that staff. And hopefully within your organization, you enjoy that level of trust, that level of responsibility as well. If not, you can take steps to earn that trust and show your value to the organizational leaders because we do play a key role, um, especially in times of crisis. Okay, some of the reading that we have this week starts with Goldberg, Rodson, Jacobson, Parker, talking about Ebola. Remember that was the crisis du jour a few years ago. And one of their key takeaways is that strong communication at all levels is critical to containing the rapid spread of disease. Now, notice what I said there. It wasn't that strong communication was vital to perception or support or meaning. Their conclusion was that strong communication was critical to containing the rapid spread of disease. It has a real impact that influences whether someone lives or dies. We saw this during the pandemic, right? Communication was key. Am I supposed to wear a mask? Where should I wear a mask? If I want to get vaccinated, where do I get vaccinated? How much information is available so that I can make an informed decision for myself and my family regarding vaccination? All that required communication. There's actually a checklist back in the appendix on page 122 of that article. I think it offers a pretty good example that maybe you can glean some parts out for your own similar checklist. Okay, another reading this week is from Heath, Best Practices in Crisis Communication. They talk about the evolution of practice through research. Best practices need constant attention. And of course, they're open for debate. I don't claim to have all the knowledge. Hopefully you share my intellectual humility and understand that we don't have all the answers. We often are the expert within that organization when it comes to communication, but there are others who will come along and offer their own perception, their own ideas, and we should be open to those. One of the best practices that this author notes calls for a pre-crisis communication during the event, and then post-crisis communication. Now, here's how I see this normally play out. We have no choice but to communicate during a crisis. So regardless of whether you planned it or not, guess what? Here you are. You better start communicating. So every organization is going to do that. Good organizations will have a pre-crisis plan, right? They're constantly planning for the next crisis. They're developing those relationships they're going to need. They're drilling or rehearsing or training or whatever term you want to use to prepare for that. That's a good organization. The best organizations have post-crisis communication. In other words, they use that crisis as an opportunity to gain lessons learned, to implement changes that will help them do even better next time. We call it a hot wash-up. After an exercise or an actual event, the key players will get together and we'll have a hot wash-up, a post-crisis meeting or meetings to review what we did right, what we did wrong, and how we can do better next time, and what changes in practice, standard operating procedures, or maybe even policy need to take place. Some of the advice that I took out of here that I'll pass along to you is, one, make sure you listen for others' concerns. In other words, as I said before, we're not the only people who can communicate, although hopefully we are the most experienced and base our recommendations upon solid research, good theory, and practice that we've had. It's important for us to exhibit honesty, candor, and openness. And then finally, one little piece, hopefully you're all aware of this, is that we've moved way beyond the past, where we used to say no comment. When I went to what's called Defense Information School, it's the school you go to when you come in to become a public affairs person in the military. You were not allowed to say no comment. And, I went to public affairs school back in 1994. So at least for almost 2 decades now, or a little over 2 decades, I guess, time goes by fast, we don't do that, right? You can't say no comment, because what that tells your audience is that you have something to hide or you're not competent enough to share what you do know. So if you have a situation where, due to proprietary issues, or in the military, of course, we have classified information, just say that. Don't say no comment. And sometimes I'll have even what I call a no comment as part of my contingency plan. What are we going to say in lieu of no comment? The matter's under investigation. It would be inappropriate at this time to discuss details of the situation. However, what I can tell you is you bridge to whatever your communication point is. Okay. Final additional article this week is from Heath, Lee, and Nee, Crisis and Risk Approaches to Emergency Management Planning and Communication. Notice, it's not just about communication for communication effort. It's how are we going to play a role in the overall crisis and risk management for the organization. One of the key takeaways from this article is that the centerpiece of emergency management communication is the persuasiveness of the expert's advice. Oftentimes, we're not the expert, right? So while a spokesperson may be introducing the topic, they may be providing the most basic of information, typically you're going to need to get an expert, some operator, or maybe even the head of the organization to address the public through the media. And it's important that people understand that they have to be willing to receive and yield to that advice. And oftentimes they have to use it for their own personal response. Think about a public crisis or a pandemic, which we're all familiar with. Who had the credibility that we relied upon in order to make decisions. All right. Final piece, there was a table 2 on page 135 of that article talking about information sources likely to be used to get emergency response information prior to a major storm or hurricane. I recommend that because, if you're not already familiar with those sources, depending upon, your organizational goals or what your organization does, it may give you some ideas to explore. Okay, that's it for week 5. As always, stay ahead with your assignments, stay engaged in the discussion board, and most importantly, enjoy your time of learning.